Awesome. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for that update, Ruth. That was lovely. I actually meant to have the update for the pastoral team meeting, but it was even better in here because I think it's great that we all get to actually know what's going on and be able to understand what we're doing to help people around the world, not just here in Perth. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to see updates a bit more often so we can actually keep our finger on the pulse as to what we're doing and how we're actually impacting the world for Christ going forward. So that would be lovely. But thank you for that update. Also, a big thanks to Tash for worship leading and also to Shay for her input as well. And it's great to see you all today. I'm glad you all made it here. We had a huge change in venue between last week and this week. So we moved from the lesser hall into here. And glad that you all made it and found us today because that was on my mind since Tuesday at least. Wasn't sure if we'd make it. But during the week, I actually have a lot to learn as I go through my new ministry, but I was informed by my council that last week went really well with regards to the interactive session, and that we covered so much ground that there was really no need to have a second interactive one this week, which is why we moved from Cafe Church back into here. But by all means, there will be tea and snacks afterwards, so we're not going to starve you today. When you get done here, we can move to the back, fellowship, and have the tea and coffees and a good time. But what that meant was that I had to put together a message for today between the week, and that was kind of fun. So I kind of felt like I was thrown in the fire, and there was one standing beside me in the fire, as he always does. Normally what I do is I'm not able to at this point prepare messages and put them on the shelf and just pull off the shelf for the week. I normally have to think about it for a long time, and then the last 3 days I begin to get it together, and the meat comes on the bones, and it takes a while to get it together. So I plan to do Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, getting the message together. Wednesday night went to SES, got back from SES at 10 o'clock, and then got a message about Ted Took in the evening. And so Thursday, went down to Bunbury to spend some time with the Took family and visit with them. Great to hear the update that he's doing all right. And when we got there, I went there with my father-in-law, and Ted Took was quite happy. He was fully with us and really glad to see us down there. But he spent so much time telling us stories about how he met Shirley and how he spent so much time in the sheep shearing and cattle industry. And it was just lovely to spend that time with him one-on-one and learn about his history and how much he's done for us in his life. So let's keep our prayers going for the entire Took family, that those who are working with him will find out what's been causing his issues, and we can pray that he receives the healing and the comfort that he needs throughout this challenging period for the entire family. So, today I'd like to just start by sharing with you guys some of the outcomes and the themes that kind of came up during last week's discussion, which I thank you all for your input on that. I think it's amazing just to sit down and listen to the buzz that goes on in those cafe church settings. I know some don't like the term cafe church, some might prefer it to be interactive church, some might want to call it something else, but whatever you want to call it, God is at work in those sessions as he is in every session that we get together, because whenever 2 or 3 gather in his name, he is with us. So whether we do it in a formal setting or whether we have tea and coffee and soup and bread and pizza, he worships and celebrates with us in all these environments as well. Different to us, but he's still with us throughout the entire journey. So last week, some of the themes that came up were, we discussed some of the implications from the Malachi reading, and what came to light there was that in those days, the people that were addressed by that message were oblivious to the extent of their deterioration in the worship that they had. They became complacent and didn't really stay accountable to what they were doing. They became weary in well-doing and kind of lost their zeal for God. So that's kind of what we learned throughout the discussions about the Malachi verses we read last week. We then talked about some of the distinctions between what a congregation is and what an audience is, and how those are different. Oh, we have the speaking of life now. That's good. That's all right. What we can do is, if we want to, we can speak of life after. And we'll speak of worship right now, if that's all right. That's good. Glad it's working. That's awesome. I just saw in my peripheral something going, and I was like, what's happening? They're like a flash from above? But no, it was the light. So, audience versus congregation. We talked about how audiences come together to to be entertained. Normally the focus is actually on the audience, whoever's up here is performing for everyone out there, and hoping that they approve of and like what they have come to see. We talked about how with the audience you normally have to pay to be there, and then when you sit down you kind of hope that whatever you receive equates to the value that you paid to be there, because sometimes you don't want to pay like $100 for a ticket and then get a really bad show and go home. That's really not ideal for an audience. We talked about how audiences are normally kind of a passive type occasion. So you sit down, relax, get comfortable, and then you wait for someone to do something amazing that you've paid to watch and see and partake in. And also talked about how being in the audience is somewhat individualistic. So you sit down and each person is expecting something different from the performer that they are hoping to see, whether it's a song that they perform or whether it's maybe a comedy show. But it's kind of an individualistic type thing when you go to and you're part of an audience expecting to see something or receive something that you've paid for in that event or that show. In contrast, congregations come together mainly to focus on God. The focus is no longer on whoever's up here, it's on God above, and all the congregation spends time worshiping together, and it involves action. So you come together and you actually do something when you're in the seats, in the stand. You get up, sing your praise, and lift it all up to God together as a family, as a team. We talked about how being in the congregation is actually a part of us joining the worship that goes on in heaven continuously, and how we get a chance to participate in that heavenly worship with our small voices here in WA. We talked about how worship helps us to connect to God. So we come together, and individually and as a congregation, we all get together and sing praise and worship, and that helps us connect to God throughout the entire experience. Talked about unity, how we're unified in worship. Sometimes we have songs that we don't like or they're not our favorites, but nonetheless, we know that the focus is not on what we like or what we prefer, but on what God is wanting us to be together for, and that is the worship and praising Him. So all these are themes that came out from our discussions from different tables last week. There was also talk about how we come together as a family, and how we're sons and daughters, brothers and sisters of God and Christ, and it's communal type worship, not just about one person or the worship leader or the actual song or lyrics that we're singing. And then we talked about how each person gets a chance to focus on God while we're here in that particular moment, and how that gets us closer to Him as we are in worship. We had a lot coming out actually regarding what congregations do as opposed to audiences. We mentioned some tables how worship normally is channeled via the Holy Spirit up to the heavens, as opposed to from the audience, from the performer down to the audience. It's not this way, it's more up and together in worship. Worship incorporates being involved. We choose to worship. We're not forced to worship. It's something that we get to choose to do. And worship is more about who God is and what He has done for us, and that makes us want to worship Him in spirit and in truth. And then we talked about finally how worship helps reflect what's happening in heaven down here on earth as we come together every week. There were a few insights and requests and recommendations that came out from last week. So I'll go through those real quickly, and then we'll talk about how we plan to take next steps and hopefully begin to implement some of those requests and changes as we go through in our family worship together. So we mentioned again that worship is derived from God and who He is and what He's done for us. We talked about some of the challenges being the attitude of no doxologies, please. It's kind of a cultural thing where we have certain cultures that we're used to, and that kind of determines how we worship and what we're used to doing in our worship. We mentioned that sometimes corporate worship is the only chance we get to actually voice physically or audibly that praise to God throughout the course of the week. And also mentioned that we need to look into being led into songs that allow us to participate. Sometimes you have amazing songs that you can listen to and sit down in the car as you're driving along, but they're not really amazing worship songs for a church family to sing together during services. And then there was a suggestion for us to begin to source some additional good worship music, which we can look into doing that shortly, and also some discussion around some of the older stuff being really good that we've kind of dropped and left behind, looking at some of those older songs that we used to sing in the old hymnals and get those back into our worship calendar as well. So we'll look at all that as we move forward. As far as next steps and what you can expect as a church family, we'd like to, number one, keep the conversation going. So make sure you keep that discussion going among the church families. If you have any recommendations or further thoughts, do speak to myself or speak to the pastoral team or anyone in the worship team. We'd love to hear feedback continually. And we want to create a loop of feedback. So we hear some suggestions, we implement them, and then see how they're going and keep that going round and round so we can begin to and continue to make sure that we worship to the best of our abilities as a church family. Next, we're going to be looking at a workshop for our leaders that allows us to have a deep dive into these topics and discuss even further. Then we'll begin to put together an action plan as far as what actions to take as a church family here in Perth, and then prioritize those actions as to what's most important and what do we put on top and what do we leave towards the bottom to get to a bit further down the road. So expectations are to see us begin to implement these suggestions and ideas, and we also invite further insights, requests, and recommendations going forward. So that's kind of a wrap-up of how last week went. Today is the third session in our worship theme for the last 3 weeks. And today I thought I'd just share with you all a few things that came to mind about worship. We all want to worship as best we possibly can, but sometimes we have no idea what's preventing us from maybe putting the hand in the air or feeling free to praise God when we have that inclination. So I was going to share with you two things that I thought of from my perspective that can become barriers to worship, and to worship in fullness of worship, like we might want to or see others do or feel that maybe that's weird, but if I could only put one hand up or one pinky, that would feel amazing. The first thing, and there may be other reasons or barriers to worship. The first one that comes to my mind is just our brokenness. We're all broken individuals. That's no secret to anyone. And sometimes you have a conscience that kind of plays in our mind and says, you know, you're not really worthy to worship God. Or maybe you've done some bad things this past week. You've told a few white lies. You maybe did something bad on the freeway when somebody cut you off. Or maybe you had some impure thoughts, or you had some negative thoughts throughout the week. And so you come and you're like, well, I'm not really worthy to be in His presence and open up and sing those songs and feel the joy that we could have with full worship. Maybe we're a bit self-conscious from time to time. So I thought I'd share one story in the Bible that kind of shares with us about one broken man and how he actually worshipped Christ. For a bit of background, this was shortly after the Sermon on the Mount occurred, and it was the longest recorded sermon from Christ in the Bible that we have written there, that covered a few chapters, as we all know. And there was a ton of people there listening to him as he preached on the Mount. It was a long sermon, and he spoke about all kinds of things, the Beatitudes, he spoke about the law, how we're the light of the earth, about anger and lust and divorce and revenge, about loving our enemies. He spoke about prayer and fasting and finances. He spoke about worrying and judging others, or how not to judge others, more importantly, and about building our foundations on solid ground. He talked about fruit in people's lives and how to get to the Father through him. Then after that, he spent time performing many miracles. He performed miracles for the centurion's servant who came to him and said, look, my servant's at home, he's paralyzed, but if you say he'll be well, then he will be well. So Christ said, as you believe, and he was healed. So he healed him remotely by just thinking about it, and boom, it happened. Amazing stuff. He healed the man with leprosy. He healed Peter's mother-in-law when she was at home with a fever. And then he actually, after that, they got on the boat to go across, and he calmed this storm that was raging and about to overturn the entire boat. So you can think about the entire happenings and how they must have been on this amazing high. They've had this huge sermon, thousands of people there, like a big revival in today's world. You have this big hurrah and revival, there's thousands of people coming to Christ, and it would have been just an amazing time. Then they get in the boat, and they begin to go across, and Christ says, let's go to the other side. So as they go along, they get through this vicious storm, which we're all familiar with that passage, and how the boat was tossed and turned. And they're wondering, where's Christ, where's Jesus at? And he's in the back of the boat just having a nap, while they're all, fussing about what to do and trying to get the oars and paddle and stuff. So then Christ wakes up, and he calms the storm, and they keep going. And you've got to wonder, when you read the Gospels, it just says they were in a storm, the storm was calmed, they go to the other side and they get there. But there must have been stuff happening in between that journey. It wasn't just sitting in a boat like, are we there yet? Are we there yet? There would have been conversations, possibly emotions, maybe some feelings, discussions going on. And I can only wonder what kind of chats they were having in that boat after the storm, after the miracles, after the Sermon on the Mount, and what that would have looked like. So you can think of, and the Bible says that Christ said, let's go to the other side, but he didn't really tell them exactly what they were going to do or what to expect when they got there. Just let's go over that way. So maybe somewhere in the boat thinking, we're going to get to the other side, and we're going to have another huge sermon for those on the eastern side. We're going to be thousands of people waiting for us. We're going to get on the beach, and there'll be like a whole crowd, and we can preach, save people, and then move it to another generation, another place. Or maybe they're thinking, we're going to get there, and we're going to have a bit of a relaxation, because Caiaphas has been busy the whole time, preaching, miracles. He must be tired. Let's go and have a pastor's retreat or the apostles' retreat and sit back and put our feet up for a little while. And probably talking about it and saying, hey, Thomas, what do you think? He goes, no, I doubt that's going to happen. We're going to go there and there'll be X, Y, Z. But they would have some interesting conversations going on throughout that entire boat ride as they get closer. So they're sailing along and they get closer and closer. And they look out, and they're probably expecting to see a bunch of people on the beach, and they look out and they don't see anyone. So they keep sailing and chatting and discussing, and they go a bit further on. Then they begin to see, as they get closer, a man on the beach. And we'll pick up the story in Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. And I'll be reading from the NIV, but all the versions are pretty much the similar story. Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 6 reads, They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day, among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. And the King James Version and New King James Version reads, when he, the man, saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshipped him. So a few observations from this particular text. Number one, they arrive at the Gerasenes region, and they're met by not a whole crowd of people waiting to see Jesus, but they're met by one man. Matthew's gospel says there was two of them, but maybe one stood out a bit more. Maybe one was kind of a bit more notorious than the other one. So they're met by a man or two men who are demon-possessed. That was their welcome crowd when they got there. And by all accounts, this man was severely broken. He was possessed by demons and was out of his mind completely. He lived in the tombs and the graveyards and lived among the dead people. And sometimes, reading through my studies this week, a couple of the accounts mentioned that when it talks about how he lived in the hills and down in the tombs and the valleys, it kind of relates a little bit to sometimes how we feel as Christians in our journey. Sometimes you feel on top of the world, you're having the best day ever, the best week ever, and sometimes you're back down there. But oftentimes you're up and down, and that's kind of the way that he was in the tombs and in the valleys and up in the hills. But that being what it is, this was their welcome party when they arrived to the region. There was no huge crowd waiting to see Jesus. There was no welcome party. They arrive, and there's one or two demon-possessed people there to welcome them. Verse 7, he shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." Verse 8, for Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." So a couple of observations on this is, number one, and this is what I've found through the studies, is that the man, the physical man, was the one who ran towards Christ. The physical man is the one who went to worship Christ. And then Christ spoke to the demon, saying, "Come out from him, you impure spirits." And that's when you heard the voice saying, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" So it wasn't the man himself saying that, it was actually the demons within him saying that part of the text. But on this occasion, what we find is that when this broken man, who was severely broken, came to Christ, fell down and worshipped him, he was actually freed from his brokenness at that very moment. We know the story, how Christ let the demons go out from there into the pigs, and they went off the cliff into the water. But this man who was broken, more than we can ever think of or imagine, was actually freed from his brokenness when he came to worship Christ. He was actually made whole, regained his senses, and was then given a commission to go back and share the story with those around him in his little village and town. Much like the commission that we're given to share the gospel with those that we bump into every day. So in a sense, we learn that worship transports us into his loving presence, and that worship liberates us from our brokenness and from our challenges that we have on a daily basis. When we're in the midst of worship, we're not really thinking about what happened last week, or the challenge we had during the week, or the bad things we saw or said or thought about last week. When we're in the midst of worship, we're thinking only about our Father in heaven and his love for us. So worship transports us into his presence and gives us that freedom to be able to spend more time and know him better. The second barrier that comes to my mind regarding what prevents us from worship is just the one of cultural barriers, and how we sometimes experience certain things that give us a predisposition to think about what worship looks like or what it means and how it should be done. Years ago, when I was living back in America, in Texas, in the mid-90s when we had the changes going on, Shay and I spent some time visiting other churches with some of our friends, because we'd get invited to go to other churches, and the GCI that we had back then was actually kind of broken up and kind of in splinters and all kinds of stuff going on, like you probably had a similar experience here. Not a pleasant place to be for some time, but we would actually go visit some friends in their churches and just kind of see what things look like outside of WCG or GCI, and that was kind of eye-opening. But one occasion we went with a few friends to a church that was a rather large church and very flamboyant type church. And it was interesting because we got there and they had this amazing choir that filled the entire stage, and they had the worship leader there, and they began to say stuff like, "Someone's going to catch a spirit in here today." And when they began worship, they're like, "Someone's going to get the spirit, they're going to fall out," and have all this kind of stuff going on, and began to prepare the audience, I use that word on purpose, to expect to see people getting the spirit during the song service. And so he goes, if someone beside you gets the spirit and falls out, make sure you're there to catch him and give him a shoulder to lean on. And then they began singing, and it was some lovely music that they were singing. They had a whole choir and orchestra going on, and they began singing and worshiping, and people began to get ready to catch the spirit. So people are taking their shoes off, and their scarves going off, and neckties coming off, and jackets, as they get ready to go into this catching the spirit type moment. And meanwhile, Shay and I are thinking, you better not catch the spirit beside me, because I'm not going to catch you. You're going to fall on the ground. If you fall over here, you're going to the ground. We're not going to catch you type thing. So it was quite an interesting event to be at. But people begin catching the spirit and losing their minds and stuff and speaking in tongues. And even one lady in the choir began catching the spirit. And I have no idea why she was up there, because she didn't even sing the song. She was just doing her own thing in the choir. And it was just a bunch of commotion. But we made it through that event, luckily. There was no one falling out beside us. And it was so bad that we got in the car and went to the nearest pub and just had a couple of drinks just to commune with the Spirit, because that's how bad that church event was for us. But luckily, we were not scarred by the event. But people have had experiences like that where they think of worship as being this crazy thing, or people losing their minds, or all kinds of stuff that people do in this day and age. So the question then is how do we worship and what does God want us to do as we worship? John chapter 4 verse 20 kind of has an account of what Jesus came across when he was walking through certain areas. John 4 verse 20 reads, "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you, the Jews, say that in Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews." Verse 23, "But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." So that kind of gives us a bit of insight as to what Christ said and how God wants us to worship him in spirit and in truth, not in confusion or not based upon how we think we should worship, but just in spirit and in truth. Allow the Spirit to guide our worship as we do it in a truthful manner. In this world, in churches around the world, people worship and preach and do all kinds of stuff. And in Acts 17:22, there's another account, pardon me, Acts 17:22, another account. It says, "Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, 'People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious,'" which is not necessarily a bad thing when you think about it in human terms. "For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I am going to proclaim to you." Verse 24, "The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands." Verse 27, "God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring." So there we see that no matter what day and age you look at, people have different ways of worshiping and trying to get to know God and get in his presence. But Paul was realizing there that we know the real true God, and we know exactly how to approach him and how he wants to be worshipped. So what I'd like to do is have a couple of readings. Galatians 3:23, and these are just verses that came to my mind throughout the week as I was looking at this topic. Galatians 3:23 says, before the coming of this faith, we were held in custody under the law, locked up until the faith that was to come would be revealed. So talking about the legalistic Mosaic law, that's what it's referring to in this particular case. So we were locked up under the faith, locked up until the faith that was to come would be revealed. So the law was our guardian until Christ came, that we might be justified by faith. Verse 25. Now that this faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian. So in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So as we think about this and realize that in actuality, without Christ, without God, we would actually cease to exist, would have no life at all. The question then becomes, how do we relate to God, especially when it comes to worship, and what do we do? Romans 8, verse 14 and 16, or through 16, Romans 8, 14 through 16 says, "For those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God. The Spirit you received does not make you slaves so that you live in fear again. Rather, this Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship and daughtership. And by him we cry, Abba, Father. This Spirit himself testifies with our own spirit that we are God's children." So as children of God, the objective reality is that we're sons and daughters of the Most High God. And when we come to worship, we come to spend time with him, to commune with him, and to, for a moment, leave our brokenness behind and be more at one with him. Galatians 2:20, "I've been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life that I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." And just to conclude, I thought it'd be good to read a couple, three versions from Romans 12, verse 1. And this is one verse that kind of tells us what worship looks like. And I'll read three different versions because they all have a different sound to them, but they all have significant meaning. Romans 12, verse 1 in the NIV reads, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." The New Living Translation reads, "And so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all he has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind he will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship him." And finally, the ESV, which is the English Standard Version, reads this way, "I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship." So there we have, from my perspective, a couple of things that prevent us from fully feeling that worship, the fullness of worship, like we would like to do sometimes. We all have different reasons why we're broken and different backgrounds and cultures that we come from. But as we can see, there's definitely a framework we're given that allows us to learn how to worship, which is basically in spirit and in truth. And I'd like us to think about these things as we move forward. We will have a few changes to our worship based upon feedback that we've had from the entire family here. But nothing, I don't think that we have to make any significant drastic changes and hallelujah type stuff. But the main focus is that we're free to worship him, and we want to worship him because of what he's done for us and because of who he is and who we are in him. So with that, have a blessed day, and may it be a week full of worship as you go along throughout the next few days. God bless you all.